start breaking it out. I might be a little too honest. Give me a second with that. Glass of scotch.
All right, good evening, everybody. My name's Lou Ann Greenwald, and I'm the director at the Hilliard Art Museum at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And thank you all for joining us this evening. This is our 7th annual John Bartholomew Bienvenu lecture, and it is our signature event of the Hilliard Art Museum, so we're delighted to be able to celebrate this with you tonight. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge some of our special guests tonight. Of course, Gloria Calais, who makes this all possible. We're so grateful to you, Gloria. Gloria made a generous gift to honor her brother, John Bartholomew Bienvenu, to mark his artistic legacy, and so this event celebrates that tonight. And we have a little thank you gift, Gloria. So thank you for all you do. Also want to welcome all the members of the Bienvenu and Calais family. It's always great to have you all back with us. Excuse me. Also wanted to acknowledge Robert Shelton. Robert and his wife Jolie hosted a wonderful luncheon for our guest speaker today, so thank you guys. It was lovely. And also our Hilliard Society, our membership group, who hosted the beautiful reception this evening. And a special shout out to Acadiana Open Channel. They are filming this tonight so it can be broadcast and we can share this with an even broader audience. So thank you guys so much for being here. So this annual lecture, as I said, is in honor of John Bartholomew Bienvenu, who was a professional psychologist, teacher, artist, world traveler, beloved father and brother and friend. In retirement, he dedicated himself to the arts through classes, workshops, and teaching, and we honor him tonight with this event that celebrates his passion for the arts. Our guest speaker tonight is Phil Sanders, and his talk is titled Neutral Ground, Mare Press, and the Role of University-Based Fine Art Publishers. This is also the title of his essay, which is featured in our soon-to-be-available publication of the same title, 20 Years of Mare Press in Printing a Campus and Community. I happen to have this advanced copy, and Cheryl Gilbo has an advanced copy as well. The other books are on a ship on their way. They'll be here soon. But Cheryl is taking advance orders if you're interested in the book, and it should be here in the next week or two, they say. This presentation tonight comes on the heels of a recent exhibition at the Hilliard Art Museum that featured an important part of our Works on Paper collection, that of the fine art prints produced through Mare Press, the university's fine art press. Tonight, Phil will talk about the importance of printmaking as a medium and the role that such programs can play in an academic setting. Phil Sanders is a master printer, educator, author, artist, and arts business consultant with over 20 years of experience in the field of printmaking and nonprofit arts management. Phil led a storied career before founding P.S. Marlowe, a successful creative services consultancy firm and fine art publisher based in Asheville, North Carolina. Most recently, he published Prints and Their Makers with Princeton Architectural Press, and you might have seen that book out front. And he contributed to our own 20 Years of Mare Press publication. A leader in printmaking, Sanders formerly served as the COO of the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts in New York City, as well as director, master printer of Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop. He also served as the master printer studio director for Universal Limited Art Editions, where he worked with such celebrated artists as James Sienna, Terry Winters, Kiki Smith, Elizabeth Murray, Carol Dunham, Jasper Johns, and Helen Frankenthaler, among others. Over the course of his long career working as a collaborative master printer, Some of the prints he produced are housed in the public collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Library of Congress, the Davis Museum, the Yale University Art Gallery, and many more. Please join me in welcoming Phil Sanders.
Thank you very much for that. Let me know if it's difficult to hear me. This is as high as the mic goes, and I'm a little tall, so I'll do my best to stand relatively still so you can hear me. I want to say thank you to Luann for inviting me to do this lecture, and to Ben for reaching out initially, putting me in touch with Brian Kelly, and to learn more about Mare Press. It's been a wonderful experience for me here in Lafayette in my time, as well as all of our conversations over the last, I guess, almost 2 years now, of talking about this press, talking about the value of this press and this workshop to the community here and to the museum. And it's been a wonderful introduction for me to this part of Louisiana. And so I'm grateful for that opportunity, and thank you all for that. So tonight, I'm going to be focusing a little bit in the beginning, because not everyone may have as much of a background in printmaking as I might have, obviously. And so I'm going to give a little bit of the history of print and the history of print publishing, and kind of how we arrived at this place where university presses exist. And then we'll get to talk a little bit more about the value of those presses relative to education of students, whether the cultural value and preservation within the institutions like the Hilliard Art Museum, as well as the value to artists who get the rare opportunity to collaborate with highly skilled master printers like Brian Kelly. So this evening, if you have questions, I'm always happy to pause and answer them as they go. So feel free, raise a hand, shout out. It doesn't have to be a monologue, and there will be time at the end as well for questions too. So the story of printmaking really begins with the story of paper. Paper was developed around 105 in China. It was a specifically ordered item. This is not something that organically developed. It was the Imperial Workshop set out a goal to create a material that they could write on that was more durable, more portable, cheaper and easier and faster to produce than the surfaces that they were working on. And as a result, all of that scientific effort and research produced paper. And what paper is, and what you're seeing here in this image, is the ancient process of paper making by hand. It's macerating a pulp or a fiber of, say, cotton or a mulberry tree, or the poplar tree in the case of most of the paper produced in the United States, into a fine pulp. It's immersing that in a water bath with a small glue, and you use a screen, as you can see them using there, to lift that out and flip it onto felt. And you layer and layer and layer, and you press it until it dries. And what you have then is a sheet of paper that we know. And this technology was so important that it was guarded for about 650 years. It did not leave China. Because paper, what it represented was an ability to communicate across time and across borders in a more efficient and cheap and effective manner. So paper was being sold into Europe at this time via the Silk Road, but it was extraordinarily expensive to get. And China really protected those few industries that had developed, think of silk trade and paper, with all that it had because it was so valuable at that time. So it wasn't until around 781 in Samarkand, or modern-day Uzbekistan, that the technology of paper made it out of China. It was sold, paper mill was set up. Paper mills in Turkey and Iran and Iraq were set up. They eventually were set up in the late 11th century in Spain, and by 1260 you had the first paper mill in Italy, in the village of Fabriano. And the image on the left is someone from the 50s in the village of Fabriano making paper by hand. But what was so interesting about what happened to paper when it got to the village of Fabriano is that it was also a tannery, it was a tanning city. And so you had two major industries growing up together, working with one another. And the advancements in paper, as we understand it today, were made as a result of cross-collaboration amongst industries. The changing of the glue or the sizing, which made the paper more permanent, more durable, as a result of byproducts from the tanning industry. The invention of the watermark. So when you hold a dollar bill up through the light and you can see an image that appears in there, that's called a watermark. That was invented in the Fabriano mill in the latter part of the 13th century. So this technology, being extraordinarily important, evolves over time. What you see on the right is a contemporary paper press. It's still doing all the jobs of the guy on the left. It's dipping that large cylinder into a vat of paper pulp. It's picking it up on a screen, and it's depositing it on a roll of felt. It's just mechanized. So we still make paper in virtually the same way as far as a process that it was made in the 2nd century in China. What we first start getting with printmaking, the very first prints, were done in the middle of the 7th century, or the part of the Tang Dynasty in China, and it was the woodcut. And woodcut as a process is extraordinarily simple in its practice and can get very complicated in its execution. But what it is that anywhere on a block of wood, a flat plank, where you do not want your image to be, you carve it away. That's your non-image area. Whatever is remaining on the surface, you apply ink to and print by hand traditionally. And that's a traditional baron made with bamboo leaves that wrap. So it's the pressure of the hand that transfers the ink. So true printmaking occurred then because it was an ink that was permanent, so it was not water soluble, that would not degrade the paper or break it down, and it would last. So the beginning of print is really based on that time when that ink was developed and could be transferred to that matrix. A lot of what I talk about, the value of print when I'm with artists or students or collectors, is that this is the beginning of the human achievement of some level of immortality. If you had an idea or a thought, you could carve that block and you could print that image onto a piece of paper. But not just once, you could do it 10 times, 1,000 times, 100,000 times, 1,000,000 times. Your voice gained in value with the reach that it could have. What print started to allow any individual who undertook the process to do was increase the value of their voice by increasing the reach of it, not just within their own time, but across time. As these pieces of paper exist in multiple locations across the world, the likelihood of your thoughts surviving, having been printed, is dramatically increased. And so what paper starts to do is, in printing and its combination, is allow these ideas to exist and persist. And what it ushers in is the growth of human technology and understanding, because it took less time for us to teach one another, because we could read it in a book. And so what you see here is the earliest example of a printed and dated book. It's the Diamond Sutra. It's from 868, and we know that because the date is on the book. And it also states why this was printed. Reverently made for universal free distribution by Wang Zhi on behalf of his 2 parents. This was printed en masse, and it was distributed all throughout China and the Buddhist world. And at this time in Buddhism, it was helpful for your reincarnation if you spread Buddhism. It was believed that the more you spread Buddhism, the more likely you were to have a more positive reincarnation. So you can understand that printing a scroll of this type and disseminating it for free may have helped out his chances in his mind. So this book exists because it was intended for distribution, right? And it has survived to this length. Now, a lot of us may have heard of Gutenberg and the Gutenberg Bible and the invention of the movable type printing press. There's a little bit of an augmentation of the history that I like to provide an audience when I have an opportunity, which is the concept of movable type and printing was invented in China around 1020. And it was done predominantly off of clay, cast clay type. Now you have to imagine the Chinese language is a composite of 3,000 characters. It's not an alphabet system. So that's a very difficult and laborious thing to set all of those characters together. So movable type was invented, but it was not used so much. Fast forward to Korea, where in the middle of the 13th century, the king of Korea, what he did was employ all of his scholars and mathematicians to develop an alphabet, to move away from a character system. They developed a 22-character alphabet, and as a result also developed metal movable type, because now it was 22 letters to move around versus 3,000. So the first metal type printing was done in Korea, and it was done to an expertly high level, and they produced books that explain that process. That's how we get to Gutenberg. So the process of movable metal type was a known technology that migrated to Europe and was able to be employed around the time paper mills are being built in Europe. And this is really where you start to see the explosion of printing. So why you don't see printing in Europe prior as a mass production product prior to this time period was because of the lack of access to paper. Once paper is available, the people with the most power and money in Europe at the time, the Catholic Church, start to commission the Bible to be printed. And so in this case, there's around, it's believed, about 168 to 180 copies or impressions of the Bible were printed. There was a set that was printed on vellum and a set on paper. The ones on vellum were illuminated, like this one, by hand. So the color was done by hand. It was done in 3 volumes. So this idea that Gutenberg invented the printing press is not one that's wholly accurate, but he did invent something that was really specific and really important, a very stiff ink, which meant you could print small type. And those of you in business mind, like smaller type, more words per page, fewer pages, cheaper production. So what was happening, he invented a really amazing black ink. And as a result, artists took that up. So if you're familiar with the work of Albrecht Dürer, why he was able to produce the work that he was because he could print a very fine white line and a black field. So the history of image making and printmaking evolves greatly alongside the industrial side or the industrial process. So the evolution of print as it spreads around the world is serving the same purpose. It's to elevate and multiply the value of the voice of the creator of that particular work. And so when we get into discussing the relationship between the artist, the printer, and their publisher, it's good to define what those roles are. So the artist is the author or the creator or the generator of either that text or that image or that combination of those things. The printer is the person who applies that to paper, makes matrices, prints those matrices onto paper, and the publisher is the person who finances it. And so the role of the publisher is particularly unique and important in this because they are the ones that determine, by and large, what work gets made, whose voices will be valued, which voices will be elevated. And I'll pick that thought up, just let that sink in a little bit. It's the person who's paying for it has the majority of the power on the voices that are valued. And so throughout history, we've had different publishers come and go, but it all began, our modern concept of fine art publishing began with Hieronymus Koch and Viljoxen-Dury. They were the House of the Four Winds. That was in Antwerp. They opened their facility in 1548. And what they did was change how artists, printers, and publishers worked with one another. The system that they developed is the system that we still use today. What they decided was that artists have particular skill. They have a vision and artistic intention. They may not have the technical acumen to either make their plates or print their plates. So what Hieronymus Koch had decided as a printer and an artist himself, that it was better to say, take this printer and pair it with this artist, and he put his money in to produce the work and then disseminate it out. Antwerp at that time was one of the centers of commerce for the entire world. It was a major shipping port, so the work that he was producing literally was being scattered to the four winds, hence the name of their print shop. It's also important to note that his wife was the one who ran the business for the majority of its life because he passed away. So as soon as he died, she took over the business. And it's also important to note that in print, this is one of the few fields that women were allowed to own and run businesses. So you will see throughout history very important female printers and publishers. And don't ask me why this is. It's a quirk of time because, God only knows it should have been allowed to be involved in everything. But at this point, there is a lot of female publishers and printers who begin to do their work, and she was one of the most important. This is an image by Peter Bruegel the Elder, and it really exemplifies what this is about in this time period and what print can do for an artist. I always love to point this out because if you're familiar with Peter Bruegel's work, you're probably familiar with his paintings. He only made about 42 paintings throughout his life. 30 of those paintings were made within the last 5 years of his life. And it's because, as an artist, he could not afford to do paintings. Paintings were expensive. You had to make all your own paint. You had to employ a lot of assistants. It was a very laborious process to get going on a painting. And you had to have a lot of money. He did not have the money or the name recognition or notoriety. He started working for Hieronymus Koch as one of his house artists. He did kind of postcardy type images, images of Antwerp, but he was also being commissioned to make his own work. And he was being paired with an engraver, Peter van der Heyden. Over 40 engravings later, his name recognition was so great that he could afford to now be a painter. right? So the value of a print of his images, because they were being printed in multiple and being disseminated out, he was not only earning revenue from his images, he was also gaining recognition. His voice as an artist was being elevated. And this is a pattern that you see throughout history from this point forward of artists' careers being built first by their interest and involvement with graphic arts. So this is an example where the printer, the publisher, and the artist are all separate people. Now, it doesn't always have to be that way. This was their studio. I just like to show this one because this was an image, it was kind of an advertisement image of his shop. That's Hieronymus Koch at the front, and that's his wife right there inside the shop. So this is where they were located. And just to give you an idea of how the artists and the printers work together in this case, so Peter Bruegel would do drawings for the engravings, and the engraver would then interpret that drawing. And as the artist learned more and more by collaborating with that printer, they were able to develop different ways of drawing to show one another how and what they wanted texturally. So this is zooming in on how they actually developed that particular image. So this process is a process that we still use today. It's the process used by Amare Press. It's a process that I use in my studio. I sometimes am also the publisher as well as the printer when I invite an artist in. And this is a case, Francisco Goya. You may be familiar with his work or his name. He is often referred to as the last old master and the first modern master, right? Because as an artist, he was the first one to really speak of his time with his time, not through allegory, about biblical or Greek mythology. He was showing and commenting on his time with his time. And this series of work, the Los Caprichos series, it's 80 images. He was the artist, and he was also the publisher. Most people don't know that he paid for the production of all of these prints. So 80 images and an addition of 250. That's thousands of prints that he paid for. And he was only able to sell this work for 3 days in Spain before the Catholic Church in Spain told him he was no longer allowed to sell them. But what happened was his prints were sold all throughout the rest of Europe. And as a result, his name grew and his recognition grew. And he would take on painting commissions in order to subsidize and pay for print publications. So this is a case where the three hats that must be worn for a print to come into the world, the artist, the printer, and the publisher, he was satisfying the artist and the publisher's part. This is an image for any of the artists in the house who've ever made a lithograph for themselves, drawn it and printed it themselves. This is pretty much how it feels when you learn to make a lithograph. This is an image by John Sloan. It's a hurricane, it's a torrent, and it's always something that's super difficult to master. And so for many artists, they love printmaking, they love making prints, but the process of being the printer is something they never want to touch again. And that's why people like myself exist, because we love that part of the process and help bringing that out. But this is a case where the artist was also wearing the hats of the publisher. He was self-financing the production of this work, as well as the printer. So any artwork in the form of print that comes into the world requires those three hats to be worn. And they can be worn by one person, three people, groups of people, but there's always a connective tissue that occurs with those. And it's the role of the publisher that is always, in all honesty, the most important. It's because that's what determines how much is made, what is made, how it is disseminated or sold, if it is disseminated or sold, right? So when we think about how all of this relates to where we are today, I like to start with the beginnings of community print workshops in the United States. This was a big shift in global history on who had access to prints and printmaking. It was a time of great change and upheaval in the world. We start with the WPA period here in the United States. So the WPA ran from 1935 to 1943. One of the divisions within the WPA was the arts division, it was the Project One, and within that was the graphic arts division. And most people, if you're familiar with the WPA artwork period, are probably familiar with posters like these. So screen print was a process that was developed and taught to artists all across the United States. Anthony Valonis created this manual, Technical Problems of the Artist. I always love that. It seems kind of existential and what every artist will face at all times. And that's what he chose to name his book or his manual on screen print. And this was paid for and produced by the federal government to be disseminated to community art workshops across the United States to help teach artists how to make screen prints. And the artists were being employed to make posters for the government, for community organizations, One of the more famous ones is Haiti, which was produced for, it was for the Harlem Community Theater, which was also a WPA project in New York City. And if you look at the image on the bottom there, you can see a copy of that poster in the background. And the women there are actually cutting stencils to create those screens right there. So what you see, though, in this period of time is a greater diverse access to the arts. It's the greatest access to arts, of whether it be artists of color or women who have been predominantly locked out of access to the arts up until this point, being included. It was the most inclusive project that the federal government's ever undertaken. And so what you see are, right here, Riva Helfand was a very important and influential artist and printmaker in this time period. She was the right hand of Anthony Vilonis, who was creating the silk screen manual. She ended up becoming in charge of teaching all the screen print for New York City. She oversaw the entire screen print section for New York City, as well as working at the Harlem Community Arts Center. And what the Harlem Community Arts Center was the brainchild of Augusta Savage, amazing African-American sculptor. And she had decided, even before the WPA had kicked in, that what her community in Harlem needed was a place for artists of all ages, all experience levels, and all desired goals for relative to what the arts would mean for them as becoming practicing artists or just lovers of the arts, to be able to work together and learn together. And so she started a small program out of the public library. And when the WPA came along, they saw what she was doing, and they fully funded it as it becoming the Harlem Community Arts Center. And what the Harlem Community Arts Center did was draw from the 306 Salon, which was a salon of local artists within Harlem who were all working at the same time, sharing ideas, discussing their own work with each other, pushing one another creatively. Just to give you an idea who's in the picture, we have, that's Jacob Lawrence, that's Gwendolyn Lawrence. This is Langston Hughes. This is Ernest Critchlow. This is Romare Bearden. This was a group of artists that met at the 306 Salon every week, sometimes twice a week, to share ideas. These individuals became the teachers for the Harlem Community Workshop. So what you see in this is, group classes, people of all ages working together in various media. And one of the places I like to stop is here with lithography. So Riva Helfand, who I showed you earlier, was one of the artists who was doubly employed by the WPA to be not only an artist, but also an educator. And there were very few of those people. And so she had a particular educational philosophy when it came to teaching printmaking. And she believed that all artists, regardless of age, regardless of skill level or stature, who were engaged in a new process, something they had no idea about, could learn from one another. Right, that they could all dive into it. So what you see here is an image by Robert Blackburn, who was 14 at the time, and Ronald Joseph, who was 24, and Ernest Critchlow, who was 34. Ernest Critchlow was in New York City because he had been commissioned by the WPA to do a massive mural. So he was a well-established, well-known artist, part of the 306 Salon. Ronald Joseph goes on to be a famous artist, and Bob Blackburn goes on to found the Printmaking Workshop, which is one of the most influential community-based arts organizations in the United States. They were all working together in the same class, learning lithography together. It was a rare thing for this age diversity to all work together. And what it produced was artists who began in the style of their teacher. These are lithographs from Riva Helfand from the period, but all went on to use that medium in their own way and create an expanded art community. So the WPA created an environment where the graphic arts became interdispersed and important relative to the vast majority of artists working across the United States at that time. So there were screen print shops, etching or intaglio shops, relief printing shops like woodcuts and lino cuts, as well as lithography shops that were opened all across the United States in that 5-year period. What it produces is a need that once that ends in 1942, for these types of community workshops to keep going, because now you lost your space to work, but you're an amazing printmaker now. The reason the WPA was funding the graphic arts workshops, because it did two things. It taught artists a skill that they could use to make work, to make a multiple of an image to help them raise more money for themselves, right, to help feed themselves in a difficult time. And it also provided a valuable public service, right? So they were getting kind of 2 for 1 in their minds with it. So, but what you end up with are things like Atelier 17, and if you're familiar with Stanley William Hayter, he was a British artist who moved to Paris, set up his famed studio, Atelier 17. He was forced to leave Paris, France in 1940, like many artists were during the war. and he set up in New York City. And what he set up was an expansive community workshop where every artist was able to come in and work and exchange ideas. It was non-hierarchical in its education. And as you see, this is, sorry, here on the left, an image of people working in the shop. And here's a group of early artists from that studio. If you look at the names in the bottom, you got Mondrian, Duchamp, Max Ernst, and one of the major funders of this whole group, Peggy Guggenheim. All right, so what happened with this studio is a lot of young artists, people like even Jackson Pollock made prints, and Norma Morgan made prints. All these great artists made work here. But when Hayter wanted to go back to France, they needed a place to go. And so, you know, fast forward, they end up with Bob Blackburn at the printmaking workshop. So Bob, this is a shot of Will Barnett there on the left, the gentleman on the left, and Bob Blackburn there in the middle, working at the Art Students League. So when Bob, as a young man, finished, you know, the WPA project closed, he was at DeWitt Clinton High School, which is in Harlem, which is an art magnet high school. You know, some of his classmates were James Baldwin and Richard Avedon. It was a very amazing group of students at that time. He continued his education at the Art Students League. You know, and one of the main reasons he was there was to work with Will Barnett, who was also a lithographer. So what you're seeing in this time period is all these community workshops are starting to try to find ways to continue after the WPA. And by 1948, Bob Blackburn has opened his own workshop, the printmaking workshop. It was through, you know, a large community effort, people helping him out. But the reason he opened his own workshop is by 1948, as an African-American man, he couldn't print anywhere else in New York City. So he opened his own studio. And predominantly, it was African-American artists, Afro-Caribbean diaspora artists, as well as expatriated Jewish artists from Europe who were also in New York City working in this studio. And what you had was this fever pitch of artists. So Atelier 17, Stanley William Hayter's artist, when he moved back to Paris in 1950, by 1952, he had closed his workshop in New York City. He was like, I'm not coming back. So all of the artists from Atelier 17 were incorporated into the printmaking workshop as well. And so at this time period, there are few places that are forming throughout the United States. And here in New York City, the printmaking workshop became the epicenter by the early 50s of where all the printmakers got to go, right? They needed a home to continue working. One of the more important images that was made in this time period, and it's important to talk about graphic images and what they can do and the type of social change that can happen, is this image here by Charles White. Charles White, African-American artist, contracted tuberculosis as a serviceman in the Second World War, had received a grant to come make prints. And so he decided to go make those prints with Bob Blackburn in New York City in the newly opened printmaking workshop. This is a portrait of John Brown. At the time that this image was created, this is 1948, it's pre-civil rights movement in the United States, this image would most likely not have been printed by a white printer. So this image, no one knows how many were printed, but it was printed in addition a well excess of 100, and it was an image that was disseminated throughout the United States. So Bob Blackburn's printmaking workshop became a haven for artists to be able to make the work that they felt was socially relevant and important, as well as accessible. So as we move into, you know, more of the contemporary collaborative printing world, what starts to happen is all of these artists who were working in places like the Harlem Community Arts Center or at the Art Students League wanted to still make prints, but didn't necessarily want to make them for themselves. So collaborative print shops started coming up. These are private, professional workshops where artists are invited in to work in collaboration with a printer, very much in the model of Hieronymus Koch and the House of the Four Winds. So the image here is of Bob Blackburn working with a very young Robert Rauschenberg at Universal Limited Art Editions, which was founded in 1957. And the reason I like to show this image is that Rauschenberg was one of those young artists of promise, but was not of the artists who we know today. He actually hated prints and printmaking. He famously wrote back to Tanya Grossman, the founder of Universal Limited Art Edition, "The 21st century is no time to start drawing on rocks." So he did not produce any prints for some time, but his good friend Jasper Johns was working with Bob Blackburn at Universal Limited Art Editions, and they're producing these amazing prints. And Bob Blackburn and Maurice Grossman, Tanya's husband, would drop stones off at Jasper's studio. He was a 4-floor walk-up. Rauschenberg's studio was on the 2nd floor. So Rauschenberg would have to help haul stones up the stairs, right? And after a while, he's like, I'm going to leave a few in my studio right now. I'm just tired of hauling these rocks, these heavy stones all the way up the stairs. And that's what got him interested in doing prints. because there's this rock sitting in his studio, and his good friends, Cy Twombly and Jim Dine, come over, and they start drawing on that stone. They're all like, wow, this is kind of amazing. This is a really responsive surface. And they all start going out to make prints. But who they were making prints with, their collaborating printer, was Bob Blackburn. Right, so all of that creative energy that Bob absorbed through the 306 Salon, attending the 306 Salon as a 12-year-old in Harlem, working at the Harlem Community Arts Center, working as Jacob Lawrence's studio assistant as a 14-year-old, all of that creative energy and knowledge of running the printmaking workshop and working with all these artists from all over the United States and all across the world was funneled into working with these youngsters. So why these artists were able to jump or leap so far ahead is they had a very highly skilled artist in his own right and technical printer to collaborate with. The image you see on the right is a print called Accident. And this is a print that printmakers often refer to as the print heard around the world. This was an image that Rauschenberg was working on, and the stone broke through the process of printing it. So lithography, you're drawing on a limestone rock, and if it gets a little thin or it has a slight dip, rocks break, they don't bend, and that stone snapped. And Bob Blackburn was devastated by the fact. I mean, you can imagine myself as a printer, your artist has spent a lot of time working on this matrix, and then you just go and break it, right? So it's a devastating thing for a printer. So he calls Rauschenberg, and he tells him what's happened, and Rauschenberg says, well, I'll come out in the morning, and I'll see what happened. And Rauschenberg gets there, and he does this thing. He says, well, can you print it? It's like looking at this broken thing. And Bob Blackburn says, well, sure. And we can take for granted that interchange so much right now, but previous generations of artists and printers, the artist would never have asked the question, and the printer would never have said yes. But in what you found was two of the most creative individuals working together going, well, let's just see what happens. And what happens is Blackburn is able to make an edition of 29 on a broken stone before it finally disintegrated into too many pieces. And it's one of the most important prints. This print literally toured the world, won all of the international print prizes, and dramatically changed people's concept of what printmaking could be. And for Rauschenberg, this turned him into a lifelong lover of prints. And, you know, Rauschenberg being from Lafayette, you know, he's a hometown boy here. His work is so important and influential, but where he learned about his love of print was Bob Blackburn. Right? So the collaborative relationship that I'm starting to describe, where a printer and an artist work together, what we're shooting for, what we're trying for, is a sum of 1 + 1 = 3, where the creative skills of the printer and the creative skills of the artist are combined together to make something that's greater than what you could do on your own. And so this is the beginning of collaborative printmaking in the United States as we understand it today. Bob Blackburn often used his own work as a teaching tool for artists. So how you explain this kind of abstract thought of I have a color on this rock and a color on that rock, but I drew everything in black and now it's going to be printed in yellow or pink. How do you explain this? So Bob would use his own work. And this is an image that Bob made in 1960 called Faux Pas, and these are different states of that. It's an important work. So there's an impression of this in the collection at MoMA, as well as a large portion of the collection of prints from the printmaking workshop at the Library of Congress. So you can always go visit these in person if you so have the time. Other things that are starting to happen across the United States in this collaborative professional environment. June Wayne, she's in Los Angeles, she's an artist. She had started working with a printer by the name of Linton Kistler, who developed an allergy to turpentine, which is a chemical we use in printmaking. So she lost her printer, and LA lost their finest printer. So she writes a grant to the Ford Foundation, receives $500,000 in 1960 money. That's a lot of money today. Start doing, I'm feeling math being done right now, for a 3-year grant to open the Tamron Lithography Workshop, which was to train printers to work in collaboration with artists to produce prints. So a lot of the young printmakers who had been either trained in the WPA era or had learned from some WPA artists started flocking to Tamron. In the photo on the right, there are a few pretty important people to note. This is Ken Tyler, who goes on to found Gemini, GEO, and Tyler Graphics. This is Clinton Adams, who would go on to write the Tamron Book of Lithography with Garo Antresian, who is one of the early technical directors. And this is Bud Shark, who goes on to run Petersburg Press in New York City and later open his own studio in Colorado, Sharks Inc. So what you're starting to see is how all of that effort and investment of the WPA era is starting to pay off and filter out into commercial printing. This is one of June's images. The Tamron Lithography Workshop stayed in Los Angeles for 10 years. She received a second $500,000 grant for another 3-year period. And then she received another partial grant for the rest of that. So she was able to take that money and do a few really interesting things with it, not just train printers, but she used a lot of it to fly collectors and curators to Los Angeles so they could see the collaborative process in person. And that's where you really start to see that growth, because she invested in the education across the board, not just for artists and printers. So this is Ken Tyler working with Joseph Albers when he founded Gemini GL in 1966. And to kind of help everyone understand the importance of print to artists, he had done some prints with Ken Tyler at Tamarind. They had worked together, and when Ken was ready to set up his own studio, Ken didn't have the money. And so Joseph Albers at the time donated his entire suite of images and the additions to him to help him get it going. Because printmaking was that important to Joseph Albers, and that relationship with his printer was that important that it was easy to give it. Right? So you start to see artists understanding the value of print to their own careers at this point. Something else that's happening in New York City, there's a man by the name of Steve Pileski who opens Chiron Press, which is the first true collaborative silkscreen company in New York City. You know, he was a t-shirt printer in Miami. That's where he learned how to do screen printing. You know, he was making t-shirts. And he said, you know what, I need to get out of this. And he moved to New York, and he went and stayed next door to his friends Elaine and Willem de Kooning. And he's got all these skills, and they're like, well, why don't you start screen printing for artists? And so he sets up a shop, and he starts working with artists. You know, a couple of people you may have heard of. Elaine de Kooning, Willem de Kooning, maybe Marisol, maybe you've heard of Helen Frankenthaler, maybe you've heard of Andy Warhol or Robert Rauschenberg. So these are everybody who he starts making screen prints with. But why I show his particular shop relative to all the other amazing studios that were opened is that his studio was only open for about 4.5 years. And what he decided to do, he's like, you know, I've done this. And he wanted to go into academia. And he took a job at Cornell University and started printing through a university environment. It's where you start to see the beginning of these professional printers who are trained in these professional environments starting to filter out into academia. So the birth of the university print shops starts around 1968. And it's because we have a lot of very skilled printers and printmakers, either who worked in Atelier 17 with Stanley William Hayter, like people like Mauricio Lazansky, who goes out to Iowa. So you see this exodus out of New York City of all of these great printmakers going into university systems that are growing and exploding because of the GI Bill and art programs expanding to include printmaking. This is when printmaking is going from just an industrial art into a fine art. And as this expansion is occurring, all of these printers who are now taking teaching positions, who have spent most of their careers working in collaboration with artists, begin to set up those types of situations within academic institutions because they know how much they have gained themselves as artists by working with other artists. That connective tissue of being pushed to make something you would never make yourself, what that can do for you. So Graphic Studios is the first program to open up. It's at the University of South Florida in 1968, was with Don Saff. One of the more famous artists that they worked with in those earlier years and up into the 80s was Robert Mapplethorpe, and reviving the process of photogravure. So what you also start to see in these academic professional environments is research being done into older processes so that they can be revived and added back in. So one of the other places that happened was the Tamarind Lithography Workshop closed in Los Angeles and was moved to the University of New Mexico and became a full program, a standalone operational program that still trained printers and still is operating today at the University of New Mexico. But what it did is it took some of the pressures of commerce off of it so that it could focus more on education. And that's where you start to get this shift in balance when we talk about the university presses, is because they can be partially subsidized or in some cases fully subsidized by the institution because of the educational value for students in the community, you can get more experimentation that can occur, right? And so you start to see this shift. So Tamarind Institute going to the University of New Mexico. Tandem Press is founded in the early 70s at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. You get the Neiman Center in the late 90s, which was opened by a generous gift from Leroy Neiman's own artwork to help fund and produce that workshop, and it's still in existence today. It collaborates with a lot of artists. It brings those artists in to work in direct collaboration with their staff as well as student printers. And they bring in people like Dana Schutz or Kiki Smith and Sanford Biggers, and a lot of really impressive artists come through those programs. There's a program that I've spent a lot of time helping develop and get off the ground, which is Flying Horse Editions down in Orlando. It's associated with the University of Central Florida. I bring artists to that studio. Like I brought Chakaya Booker there to do a project with her there not too many years ago. She's an artist I work a great deal with, as well as artists like Will Cotton. So the idea is using these situations to train young people, not just in the technical process, but also the collaborative process, how to work with other artists. And now we get to Mari Press and why this is such a unique and wonderful thing for your community. To me, when you have an exhibition like this, and I talked with Ben about it initially because I was in shock and disbelief when he actually told me this. I said, he's like, we're putting this exhibition up and we're going to put all the artworks, the entire collection on the wall. And I was like, wait. Seriously? You're going to put every single thing that's been produced on the wall? And he said, yes, we're going to put it all on the wall. I'm like, that's amazing. I've never seen any institution do that before. And why it's so amazing is that it's not just looking at the works of the most famous artists who've come, but it's looking at the works of all of the artists. It's to showcase the entire community that has been here for the last 20 years, coming and going from the institution, influencing the students and the faculty who are here, producing works, because there's this thing that happens for a student, and I am a product of this, and so I can speak to this purely. The University of Florida had a very small publishing company. It was called Aligarto Press. Yes, it was the Gators, it was Gainesville, so it was not a creative name. But what we did was invite artists in from other places like New York City or Miami or Los Angeles, and collaborate on prints with them. My personal introduction into printmaking, 1 week into my first printmaking class, was assisting on one of these projects with an artist by the name of Phil Smith. That experience of being able to assist a practicing working artist in the field with making their work, the conversations about what is important, what needs to stay, what you need to try to produce for them for it to be right for their work, was invaluable, and it was invigorating, and it was exciting, and it produced a lifelong pursuit for me as a printmaker and someone who's going down this road. So what all of these works are doing while they're being made is doing that for students and doing that for faculty. It's exposing them to a world that's much wider than the one they live in, and it's allowing them to be more active and creative in their own process. But what it's also doing for your community, because this collection is also associated with the Hilliard Museum, is it makes it accessible for all of you to see. And so when Ben was like, I'm going to put them all up, I was like, this, I hope, becomes an example for other institutions to do the same. Because when you walk through this exhibition, you're going to see work by artists who may never be known again. May never know who they are right now, but be moved by that work. And you're going to start to see connections and threads from one piece to the next. Because a piece that's being produced in that studio is also influencing the next artist who comes into that studio. And it's a cumulative effect. So, and prime example in the printmaking workshop, you have one artist working on something, another artist working over here looks over, sees something interesting. It influences what they do. So you may have an artist who is, from here in Louisiana, who may not have a major career outside of here, and an artist who comes in from New York City, who has a big career, who's seeing that work and being influenced. And when you see all that work together, you start to understand the connections between those works. So it was exceedingly rare, and it's a very special thing that's occurred. The Library of Congress purchased a selection of prints from the printmaking workshop, over 2,200 prints in early 2005. And there was a stipulation put on it that they could not just pick the famous people who had come through, but they had to have at least one print from every artist represented in the archive. And that was over 1,800 artists, more than 2,200 prints, because it filled a critical void. It filled a void of artists who were mostly underrepresented in the larger art collecting community, artists of color, especially working in abstraction, in the national collection. And it also showcased the inner workings of a long-running community workshop. And what you had here was something very similar and very special and unique, but you had it fully on display. And what it was showing how all of these artists have been involved here. And it tells of all of the countless stories we will never know about how these artists working in the studio influenced students. And when you walk through this exhibition, what you're seeing is every artist's unique expression of how they treated the medium in collaboration with Brian Kelly, master printer Brian Kelly, who's the director of Mari Press as well as the head of the printmaking department. So in selecting artists who come, you're looking for works that are individual voices to be promoted and championed. You're also looking for things that can educate students. You're looking for things that push you creatively as the collaborating printer. And so what you're seeing with more than 200 and almost 290 works, I believe, is a wide swath of what's possible with the process. And for students, they get to see artists that emulate maybe where they want to go. and it's an invaluable teaching tool. And so when we think about what's the value of print, we go back to the beginning, which is it elevates and amplifies the artist's voice. And what's the value of print within a university setting? It's helping young artists understand the value of their own voice by helping to produce prints that amplify the value of the voices of the artists they're working with. It gives them a pathway, and it gives them a validation as to the value of art within our culture and for us personally and individually. And so when I think of university presses, there's about 24 of them at my last count that are still running and existing throughout the United States. When you think of how many universities there are in the United States, the fact that you have one here in Lafayette that's functioning, not only bringing artists in, but really making a lot of amazing work, it's a very special thing. So when I was asked to do this, and Ben said he was going to go ahead and put everything up, I was like, well, I can't say no to that. I have to write an essay about this. I have personal experience with it, and if anything we can do is to help keep this going out there, right? And so, you know, for me, there's a great pressure to help replace ourselves as collaborating printers. And one of the places you can do that are in institutions like this that have the opportunity for students to work alongside a master craftsman like Brian Kelly, who's working with artists to produce these types of works. This is where the pipeline that's required. So the places that when I was the director of the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop in New York City, where I would get most of my young students and interns was from programs like this, where they had had exposure to professional printmaking. So they found their way to New York City to be able to have a workshop and a community to work in. So the value that you have in a facility like this, and this is Brian here printing. If you don't know Brian, you'll find him here right after this, is that what you're doing is exposing the community at large to artists working. So it's not just getting to see the final product, but it's actually getting to see how you got there. And that's a really important part, because in printmaking, one of the things that we're doing is we pull proofs. You make a mark, you print it onto paper, you make more marks, you print that onto paper, and you can compare what you did and what you have now to one another. So there's no subjectivity of memory when it comes to the making of your work. So some artists really love that, and other artists it's absolutely terrifying, because you're like, oh, it was so much better before, and you can't walk away from that fact because you can see it. But why a lot of artists love printmaking is because it teaches them so much about their own work and their own creative process. And working in collaboration with a printer allows you to reach further, to experiment and push in a way that is completely supported. And when you do that within the confines of an educational environment, what you're also doing is saying that the money is not the important part, because the commerce element is not the driver in an academic setting. It's the educational environment. It's the education for the students. It's the education for the collectors or the people in the community that get to come and see that work. And it's the education for the artists. So it's wholly unique to have. It's a precious gem to maintain within the print world, that we have these places where printmaking can survive in this way. But I also like to put on the fact that you also here have a great responsibility as a publisher on who you choose to publish, which voices you choose to elevate and value. Because not only will they be amplified in the form of an edition, but they will also be collected by the museum. And they will become part of this canon, this legacy of the work that has already been done with the work that will continue on. And it's that understanding that role and responsibility of a publisher, of which voices you choose to elevate and why, which voices will get added to the canon, so that the next time you do this show, when it's 500 works, which might only be 2 years from now if Brian keeps up the pace that he's at as a printer. But what it means is that you will have the opportunity to affect the long-term collective record or memory of a cultural moment. So prints survive. If you make a painting, some artist makes a painting, a collector buys it, they love it, say it goes in the bedroom, it's not necessarily on the art tour of the house. Maybe 50 people get to see it in the lifetime of it living in that home. And you hope that the children or grandchildren have value in it, or can find that artist's name on Google and don't decide to toss it because it was so special to you. If you have a print now, in an edition of 50, that 50 goes times another 50. That work that artist has made has a greater chance of surviving and a greater chance of influencing. And so the role of the publisher is so critical in preserving a cultural record. And it's not always about the most famous voices, but of the voices that have made a contribution, the voices that have affected. And so when I think about the university press and the role of the university press, it is to help maintain not just the craft of printmaking, it's also to educate future generations how to do it. It's to educate artists as to the value of it to their work, educate a collecting community as to the value of supporting prints and artists' voice in that way, as well as to leave a record for future generations to better understand who they are, because they better understand who we were through the work we leave behind. So that's where I'll leave it for now. I'm happy to take some questions. Do we have?
Can you explain for people who may not know what this final slide is?
Oh, sure. This is what's referred to as a chop. Or if you're familiar in the book publishing world, it's a publisher's mark. And this is something that is generally embossed or stamped onto every impression that a publisher produces. So every print in Mari Press will have this. This is the logo of Mari Press. And so I have one from my studio, as well as most studios do. So if, when you go back in history, and you can look for the publisher's marks and even printer's marks that'll appear on books or old impressions. If you're familiar with the work of Albrecht Dürer, you'll be very familiar with his monogram. That was his publisher's mark because he self-published his own work. So that's what this mark is. So if you see this on a print somewhere out in the world, you know where it came from. Oh, sure. That's correct. Yes, the Chinese invented the concept of printing. The original relief printing from wood. It was carved wood and stone blocks that were originally printed from. So they also invented paper. So we owe a great deal in debt to the continuation of human culture relative to the printing of words and images due to that technological advancement. Most of those old antique works, like the images of what it was like to make paper back then, those were actually from prints that were done to document the early process. Yeah. Well, most of those are housed in, say, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the British Museum, the British Library. They're housed in other collections that are digitally available, especially for educational purposes. And so you can go visit a lot of those works because many of those museum collections are publicly accessible. So anything in the collection, the prints and drawings department of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you can call them up, tell them what you want to see, and they will pull it out for you. You can walk right in and it will sit on the table right in front of you. It's an absolutely amazing treasure. So the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the New York Public Library, the Grunewald Collection in Los Angeles. There's many publicly accessible collections like that in the United States, as well as some in Europe. So yes, you can see a lot of that work in person. So like that Peter Bruegel, you can see that in person. They also have things like wood blocks and engraving plates from Albrecht Dürer, and you can look at the block and the print side by side. So they're amazing resources that I highly encourage you to take advantage of. The print departments are generally the most friendly places in a museum. They're the happiest people and the most like, come on in, let's talk about stuff and see stuff. So if you want to see something, find the print department. They'll always welcome you in. So, sure.
I'm curious what you would think about the inclusion of digital prints in university publishing. My undergrad was at Alfred, and we had the IEA, and which brought in fantastic artists, and getting to handle even just the digital works of Anne Hamilton and Woody Fasolka and Kari Archangel and all these artists coming through brought their ideas and their energy through that university, but also industry money, because the printing, I don't know, Canon and HP would donate printers because they wanted students and people trained on them. And it was all within the same division of the school as the traditional printmaking.
So for me as a professional printer, it's just another tool in the toolbox. So I refer to the tools that we use as printers have an additive toolbox. Every technology that comes along goes in the toolbox. We never take anything out. All printing technology was developed for industrial commercial purposes, all of it. It was not developed for artists specifically. Artists took up the mantle of all these new technologies, whether it be the fancy new technology of stone lithography in 1798, which supplanted all of the printing industries at that time within a 15-year period. So the letterpress and intaglio industries, especially mezzotint imagery, was decimated because it was easier to draw on a lithostone and faster. Right, so we, in our history of printing technology, are very used to technological disruptions and adopting what's available or usable for us at that time, but we just add another tool to the toolbox. And that's really how we see it. So long as things are physical, they're printed. They have an opportunity to continue to influence. And I talk a great deal about, in this time period, I mean, how many of you have lost a hard drive and all the digital photographs on it? How many of you have printed an email that was particularly special from a loved one and have lost it? Right? So we're in this era where so much of our lives live in the digital world, a place that's not physical. So, but what we choose to print becomes even more important in an era where we print very little of what's actually valuable to us. The vast majority of what is printed today is disposable. Right? The concept of disposable printing happened within 200 years of the invention of printing. So packaging was being printed at that point, advertising. It came in from the very beginning. And so, printmaking is an industrial art. But I always like to tell people the word art has always been on there, right? Because once you had the opportunity to print something, you also had the opportunity to choose the aesthetics of how that looked, right? So the arts were always a part. It was integral and a part of whatever printing process there was. So to me, when I think of digital printing, it's just another tool in the toolbox that artists can use to their advantage to make images that can survive and impact us now and into the future. So I don't really, most of us in the professional printing world, we have absolutely no distinction between digital printing and printing. It's appropriate process for the appropriate outcome. So if that's what makes sense to help an artist execute their idea and vision, that's what we'll use. Does that answer your question? So just, kind of to dovetail on that a little bit, I really, look at printmaking as being one of the more important things we can still do because of how it elevates the voice and because it is a permanent record. Because if we only live in that digital world, we do not take ourselves into something physical, it will be lost. I mean, how many of us have lost hard drives because it's not going to translate into the next technology moving up, right? So if you didn't print it out, you don't have it. It's why Wikipedia, if you're loving your Wikipedia to find stuff out, prints it every 10 years to have a record of what it was. It's a huge undertaking, but it's extraordinarily important to create and capture a cultural record, right? So what we print and what we leave behind is all anyone else in the future is going to have to know about us. And if all they have is our money, our posters, our packaging, that's all they're going to know about us. Right? They're going to miss a lot of the nuance of who we are and why we exist and why we chose to do what we do. So it's important and even more critical in this type of a time to support young artists learning to print, learning to collaborate. I can't stress enough that collaboration is a huge skill in and of itself that's highly transferable to any industry. So watching a collaborative printer like Brian working with the artists that are being brought into Mare Press is in and of itself an invaluable education. It's learning how to get two people with different skill sets to work together to create something together that not only is a full execution of their combined vision, but is actually good. So, it's not just like, oh, we did it, it's a feather in our hat, but it's actually good. And so that in and of itself is extraordinarily important, that creative processing and thought process and skill sets. So for me, anytime I get a chance to help the university fine art press systems survive, I take that advantage up. And, but it also, it goes back to who you choose to invite is extraordinarily important. It's a great responsibility that you bear, to ensure that more voices are being heard. So.
Thank you for this really insightful talk. I am always fascinated by the backstory of printmakers in terms of how you initially found your way to it or became attracted to it as a medium. Do you mind sharing some of that backstory for you?
Sure. I mean, I got into the art department. I was going to do painting as a painter. I had a disagreement with a painting instructor and decided to take a semester break from the painting department. And I was like, what's this printmaking thing? I was 19 years old, took a printmaking course, and that was the beginning of the end for me of doing anything else. And it was really the fact that we had an invitational print publishing program. So it was a week into my first printing class where I was alongside a professional master printer who was working with an artist. And he asked me, he said, have you ever wiped an etching plate before? And I said, no. And he hands me this thing. It's 22 by 30 inches. And he's like, do what I do. We need this in 10 minutes. And I was just like, all right, we're game on. And it was an intense week because we had 6.5 days with this artist to produce a body of work. Not just one print, but we were producing 5 prints. And so all of this proofing and all this work, so I was just thrown in the deep end at assisting. And what I gained from that was a lot of really particular but small things. And one of them was that everything matters, right? Every detail matters. You can't accept anything other than the highest level of quality because it's just not worth your time to invest to go any less. And that you never will know what it's going to be like in the end until you push yourself through it. But you have to follow that thought through to really truly know. And those were invaluable things to learn in the second week of a printmaking class. And so for me, that was the end of it. That was the beginning of a long career of dedicated time on the press and the arts. So without that experience, who knows where I'd be? That was integral to my education. And the printers that I was working with at the time was Kenneth Kerslake, who was amazing printmaker and artist himself at the University of Florida. Robert Mueller, an amazing lithographer. I learned a great deal about lithography from him, and a man by the name of Preston Lawing, who was also, he was a collaborative master printer, and he decided to go back to grad school to get a master's degree so he could teach. And so I'm standing in a room with, combined master printers experience of about 90 or 100 years worth of experience. Right, so that's what you get dropped off into, and if you're willing to, tap into the experience of that printer you're working with, you can learn a great deal very quickly, right? So as I was being incorporated into, a long tradition or a lineage, and a lot of us printers talk about the lineage of and printers that we have been influenced or taught by, and so for me, I've worked in a lot of different shops across the United States, across Europe, and in South Africa. I've learned from a lot of different artists and a lot of different printmakers, and that's what's kind of the soup that's made me as a printer, and when I go to train, that's what they're being trained from, that lineage of printmakers as well. So I owe a great deal to Bob Blackburn, not only as from an absolute inspiration, but from looking at his work and understanding that technical side, as well as working to push and pursue his vision when I was the steward of his workshop for almost a decade. So we owe a great deal to that. So those foundation points are very, very important. I mean, I guess the last thing to say on that, because I think it's relevant to all of this, is Kenneth Kerslake was he was approaching his retirement and starting that process when I was a student at the University of Florida. And the Harn Museum of Art, which is a wonderful museum there in Gainesville, was mounting a career retrospective of his work. And so I went to go hear Ken speak about it. And I'm listening to it, I'm seeing all this work and hearing about all this. And what I wanted to know, the one burning question I had, and so I asked it when it was time for questions, was, with all of your years of printing experience, do you know what the print's going to look like before you lift the paper from the plate? And he's this giant man with a big goatee and bald head and had this Mickey Mouse voice, which totally didn't fit. He was like, oh no. and he said, no, it's either horribly depressing or the most wonderful surprise. And I was like, 65 years into printing, this is something that I can pursue, because you're never going to stop learning. There's no end point, especially when you're working with artists who are pushing you to try new things, and you're open to that. If you emulate Bob Blackburn and Rauschenberg in that place where artists ask you a question, your answer should be yes. You should want to figure it out, no matter if it's even possible or if you even have an idea. When I do a lot of work with James Sienna, this artist, and one of the things he always says, he goes, what I love about printers, he goes, what makes a good printer from a bad printer is the one that always says yes and then goes home and figures it out before you show back up in the studio. He's like, because that's the person I want to work with, because no matter what harebrained idea I have, they're going to figure it out. They're not going to sleep until they figure it out. And that's, it's just part of your DNA. And so that's what makes us tick. It's what gets us out of bed in the morning. I have ideas, and I have I got to go call this artist because we got to do this thing. This project would be crazy. It's something they would love to do. And so we're, pitching ideas to artists too, because we're part of that process, right? And so that's what I learned so early on in printmaking and that academic environment, was that your job is to push. Your job is to look. Your job is to investigate. And then it's not just to stop there, but it's to make something to then share the results of that investigation with others, right? And that's what the artwork is really intended to do, is to let everyone else see the world through their eyes for that moment, right? And so that was that foundation that I learned. And, you know, Ken learned that working with Bob Blackburn in the printmaking workshop in New York City in the early 50s. So it's this, that's part of my lineage of how I came to understand printing was through that as well. Any other questions? I can talk forever, by the way, so you can't stop asking questions. So, well, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate your time.